Hey everyone, today I'm back in Besiege and I wanted to try making a transmission for my car. I have the first two videos on my car in the playlist linked in the description. And also guys, before I get into the video, I know you probably heard this like a million times, but I heard it helps out the video and my channel if I ask you guys to subscribe early in the video. So if you could do that for me, I'd greatly appreciate it. With that out of the way, let's get right into it. Alright, so the first thing I do is load into the sandbox, and I want to create a basic frame to be able to put an axle on and the whole transmission. So I build that up here, and seems to work well, holds together. And the next thing I want to do is add some sort of axle in. So I have two swivel joints there, and that'll allow me to have the axle rotate and not have to rotate the frame with it. So I build it up a bit more there and then attach it to the frame. But I noticed a slight problem. When it drops, the swivel joints aren't actually attached to each other. And it's actually an easy enough fix, I just have to rotate them around the other way. And now it seems to be working. The axle rotates slightly when it falls, and also it stays attached to the frame. So with that working, the next thing I need to do is brace the axle together. And I need to do this so that the axle rotates as one big piece instead of a few disjointed pieces. And I'm also shortening the ends there, and that's so I have a bit more room to put on two wheels. And these wheels also need to be braced to the axle, and this is so that they rotate with the axle. So after doing that here, it seems to work, but there's really no way to check unless I add power to the front wheels, which I do here. So now as I tell the front wheels to rotate forwards and backwards, you can see how the rear axle also rotates. And this seems to be working. So the next thing I need to do is add some sort of way to apply power to the rear axle. And I do that by just basically inserting a gear into the middle of it, and then I have to brace the axle together a bit more. But now if I do the same test, you can see that the gear rotates with the axle. And now the next thing I want to do is just add another gear on top of that gear so that I can raise up where the gear train needs to be. So I do that with a few wood pieces here, and then I add in a big gear. And now if I run the same test I did before, you see as the axle rotates, it rotates that big gear. So the next thing I did was just add a swivel joint to strengthen the gear. And now I want to create the system to have a variable speed transmission. Now the first thing I think of doing is adding a stack of gears like this and attaching them to a piston. Now I made a mistake here. What I actually wanted to happen was when I hit the key to expand the piston, it would actually pull in the other gear, but instead I have this. But you can sort of see what I'm getting at. As I expand the piston, it pushes the one gear out of the way, and it will engage the other one, and I'm fixing that here right now. So after getting that all in place, you can see as I try this out and I pull in the piston, I can engage one gear or the other gear, and this is what I want. This should give me some way to control what speed the engine is going, or the transmission is going. So I just added a large gear to the end of the gear stack and also moved everything over the rear axle. And now it's working the same way, but what I can do is attach that first gear to the large gear, and this gives me a gear reduction. Now it's not going to look like a gear reduction here, it's going to look like it's increasing in speed, but you have to remember I'm driving the transmission in reverse right now. So it's going to be increasing in speed, but in actuality it's going to be decreasing in speed. And I didn't quite know what to do with my little piston setup there, but the gear reduction did give me inspiration for this, which somewhat worked. By adding two pistons, what I can do is expand and contract them and adjust which gear that small gear is attached to. And if I drive the transmission, you can see that these gears give a different speed to that small gear on the end. And now if I replace that small gear with a powered gear, and then replace the powered wheels with regular wheels, if I try to drive the car, it sort of works. Now the problem with pistons is they have a little bit of give, so the gears could easily just slip on each other since the pistons are happy to expand a little bit out of the way. So I gave up a little bit too soon on the pistons, as you'll see at the end. But for now, I wanted to work on a different solution since pistons really didn't seem like they were going to work out. So after deleting that piston setup, I didn't quite know where I wanted to go, but I decided I wanted to get the gear reductions all on the same plane. And here I have that. You see the bottom gear is rotating much slower than that top gear. And I wanted to add in one more reduction. Really, I just thought it'd kind of be cool to have a 3-gear transmission. Also kind of made sense, I guess. Well, not 3-gear, it'd be a 3-speed transmission. Whatever. So after adding in a bunch of framing pieces and finally adding in the small gear and then the large gear, you can see I get that final reduction, even though it's not a reduction right now. Since I'm driving in reverse, it seems like the opposite, you know. So I add in a small gear stack here, and then rotate the small gear so that it can mesh properly. And now as I try to drive it, you can see the top gear is rotating the fastest, the middle gear is rotating the middlest, and the bottom gear is rotating the slowest. And I was hoping this would make it pretty easy to come up with some way to be able to control which one of these gears I want to engage with. So here I strengthened everything up as well, added a few more framing pieces in, just to make sure things weren't going to be jittering around so much. And finally added in a single wooden block and a simple powered gear. And now I can drive the transmission with this. But if I try to add in a piston, you can see the gear ends up just moving down into the frame of the car since the pistons aren't strong enough to be able to hold it in place. And I messed around with quite a few different ideas to see if I could create some sort of gear selector. and I didn't really get anywhere until I eventually settled on the simple rope and winch. Now this ended up being kind of awesome, because what I could do is have two opposing sets of them, one on top and one on bottom. So when one was winding, I could have the other one unwinding. So now as I expand and contract those winches, I can move up and down the gear, adjusting where it is. Now, that wasn't great, the gear just fell over. But what I can do is have a simple wooden block in the middle, and then have 4 of these pulley systems, and after setting all the keybinds correctly, it moves up and down in a pretty controlled way. And finally putting a gear on the end. I was going to try driving the top gear, but what ended up happening is that back piece of wood just started rotating randomly, which was an easy enough fix, but there's something else I want to do in the meantime, which is just make this be able to move up and down the full length all 3 gears so that I'm able to engage with all of the gears. And so now I'm adding in a few gears into the right side, and the hope is that I can have the gear in the middle be able to bridge the gap between the gears in left and right. So after quite a bit of tweaking, you can see that sort of ends up working out, except the gear ends up sort of just sliding out of place. It doesn't really want to mesh, and this is with no power applied. So I realized I was going to need some way to be able to hold the gear a bit tighter than just the ropes. And I thought I could do it, I was just going to need to move everything down a little bit more. So after moving that starting block down and reattaching all the winches, I could use these slider blocks. And the sliders seem to help to hold things so that they only could move up and down and a little bit less to the sides. Now it was still not perfect and it could still sway a bit. I was going to need to add another system to have this lock a bit better, but it was at least getting closer to what I wanted. And finally I need to add that to the other side, so it's basically just a mirror copy of what I had. And now as I try to move the gear up and down, you see it's much more stable. And at first it's skipping a lot, but after eventually getting the car to start moving, I ended up just sliding in place and not moving around, which was pretty good. Now second and third gear were still a bit of a mess, and the sliders were still allowed it to kind of fall out of place since there's just so much torque on the system. But now I thought I was getting much closer, and I wanted to work on one of the last things I was going to need to actually apply this to the car I made in the last episode. And that's this gear setup on the other side. So after adding this stack of gears in, what it allowed me to do is have a single point of power, which I could attach to an engine or something, instead of having to move it up and down with the slider piece. So after replacing the power gear I have in the sliders with just a standard gear, and then replacing that center gear on the right side with a powered gear. As I try to spin up the powered gear, you can see the car starts moving in third gear, and I get it in second gear, and it moves roughly the same speed, but that's okay. And I put it in first gear, and it does actually move a bit slower. So with that, I thought I was really close. The only thing I had left was some sort of mechanism to lock onto the sliders and hold them in place a bit better, since they're still allowed to slide out too easily. So one last trick I decided I could use to maybe increase how stable this was having a grabber on the end of a piston. And by extending the piston, I could grab onto the slider and then hold it in place a little bit better. So I'm trying that here, got it expanded out, and then extend the piston out, which has the grabber grab onto the slider, and it grabs onto it, but I only have the one in place right now, so it doesn't really do too much. So I added in 4, so I have 2 on each side, and you can see here how that sort of works when it expands and contracts. And I can try it here, and when I grab on, it holds it a little bit better in place, and this actually gives me the ability to be able to drive this thing with only a little bit of slipping, so the majority of the power coming from the powered gear is going to the axle, which is definitely good enough for me to move this thing onto my car that I made in the last 2 episodes. So I went and loaded up my car from the last episode, and it works just like you'd expect, except it has a static gear reduction, and that's what we're looking to change. So I basically just moved everything I made in the last car onto this one. It looks like a lot happened, but it's everything you've already seen. I've done nothing new at this point. And now I'm adding in the gear train to attach the transmission to the rear axle, since it ended up being that the output gear was at the front. I didn't really plan that one out too well, but whatever. So it's an easy enough thing to do. I just had to basically make a long trail of gears moving all the way to the back, and that's what I'm putting in here. And after getting all of those in place, I wanted to disconnect the engine temporarily and just use a powered gear, just so that I didn't have the problem of the engine stalling on me. I'm also kind of cheating a bit here by using some balloons to lower the weight of the car. Now, I guess it's not totally cheating, because I could just replace the wood pieces with ballasts and bracing pieces, which would lower the weight of this dramatically. Eventually, I'll probably come back and do that. Now, if I try to drive the car in first gear, you can see it ends up working actually pretty well. The car is moving backwards because I just have the gear rotating backwards. But the moment I try to put it in second gear, the gear just starts slipping a lot, and sometimes it engages, but sometimes it just starts slipping. And I think the problem with this was just the way I had the grabbers working and the way I had the slider joints going. Just, this wasn't a very robust solution, and it was definitely way overcomplicated. And I ended up going back to pistons to be able to solve this. Now I have this large wooden beam in the back and a few pistons here, and I'm going to be putting gears on them. and I can tell pistons to expand and contract with different key presses, and this will engage different gearing ratios. Now, I know I mentioned in the beginning of the video that pistons weren't going to work because they can allow the gears to slip past each other, and that's still an issue. As you see here, the gears are still slipping out off of each other. But now with the grabbers, I can end up solving this problem pretty easily. Now if I put swivel joints on all the gears, if I expand a gear out, it ends up getting attached to the grabber, and the grabber holds it very tightly in place. And I can let go of it by hitting V on my keyboard. And here you can see after I made just a few modifications, the gear can expand out, and gets held very tightly in place. And this is actually the first gear test. Now it works basically the same way as before. This was working in the previous design, so nothing really changed besides the fact it's moving forwards now. For reasons I don't understand, the engine ended up stalling for some reason. I probably accidentally hit the keys that control the engine on my keyboard, but whatever. So now putting it in second gear, and remember, this did not work before. And now it's actually working perfectly fine with minimal slipping. And finally, here's third gear. And this was working when it had just the power gear attached to the transmission, but the engine just does not have enough power to be able to overcome that. This engine is definitely underpowered, and I think in a future video I'm probably going to have to make a better one, maybe like a V6 or V8 or something. And I know I'm going to get a ton of comments if I don't try to do this, so now I'm trying to shift while the car is moving. So I start off in the first gear here, and I switch into second gear, and things seem pretty smooth. Remember, these gears started from a stop, so that's not really a surprise. Third gear here is the problem. And right there you saw that I ended up trying to shift, and it stopped for a little bit, but the car still had enough momentum, or at least the gears did, that I could overcome that and for the most part keep going. Eventually I did stall the engine, but it was at least pretty good. I definitely again want to get a better engine on this. I think that'd be fun to make. So guys, thanks for watching. I don't know if this transmission really has any practical benefit in the game. It's more of just a proof of concept or just something interesting to make. I don't really think it improved the car in any appreciable way, but again, it was sort of a cool thing to make. So make sure to subscribe if you want to see more of this content. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to ask below. And until next time.